The Bread Lab by Natalie, Annalise, Erica, and Anthony.
Yeast and its functions. Yeast is a type of fungi. Yeast converts glucose into CO2 and ethanol alcohol. Yeast performs aerobic cellular respiration when there is oxygen and anaerobic respiration, fermentation, when no oxygen is present. It is a facultative anaerobe, so it can switch between the two.
The type of fermentation that occurred in his experiment was alcoholic fermentation, led by yeast. Like Anthony said, this is a type of cellular respiration that is anaerobic, meaning that no oxygen has to be present. It first starts with glycolysis, where glucose is broken down into two pyruvate molecules. And the second step is where these pyruvate molecules are converted into 2 carbon dioxide and 2 ethanol. In the bread making process, the yeast performs fermentation on the flour, and the CO2 produced makes it rise. And the bubbles are also created by CO2, but only a little bit of the ethanol is left in the bread after baking.
So gluten is basically just a bunch of like protein molecules like together. It's kind of like stringy, and it's what gives bread its like texture on the inside. It comes from flour and water mixed together, but that's only with certain flours. Gluten is important in bread because, yeah, again, it's what gives bread its structure. It also traps like air bubbles on the inside, which like lets the dough rise, I guess, for the bread. It doesn't make it like a compact like ball of dough.
Here's our recipe. We decided to cut the recipe in half to save ingredients. So we combined the flour, yeast, and salt and water, and then we let it rest for 3 hours. And then after 3 hours, we put it in the fridge for 18 hours, and then we baked it. So on the top is the dough, and on the bottom is one of our bread loaves. We decided to change the amount of water used in the bread. The baseline of the recipe was 3/4 of a cup of water. Each member experimented with a different amount of water. So some people did less water and some people did more water.
And from our data, you can see in the graph, is that as more water was added to the dough, like the length and width of the bread would like increase, but the height would decrease, showing that like it would flatten out, probably because there's like less structure to it and the water is making it more liquidy.
And qualitatively, we noticed that the texture of the bread got softer as more water was added because the dough was more liquid-like, and also more and larger bubbles were present inside of the bread. So here you can see like the different breads for each amount of water. And the changes were less noticeable than the quantitative variables in this lab, but they were still there. And for the controls in this lab, we controlled the amount of flour, yeast, and salt. So basically every ingredient except for the water. And the recipe was basically the same. We let it rest for 3 hours and in the fridge for 18 hours. And the size of the loaves before fermenting and like letting it rise was around the same. But gravity did play a role, and it caused like wetter doughs to flatten. And the variables that were not controlled were the brand of flour, salt, and yeast used, and also the material that the baking pan was made out of. Some were metal, some were glass. And the temperature, like the room temperature that we let it rest at for 3 hours, and also the temperature of the fridge.
As more water is added to the bread, quantitatively, the length and width of the loaf increases while the height decreases. And qualitatively, the bread gets softer in texture and has larger and more bubbles as water is added.
For evidence, we noticed that the dough with more water had a more liquid-like consistency and also rose more overall. It also had larger and more bubbles. Concluding from these results, alcoholic fermentation occurs quicker when more water is present.
So for reasoning, we noticed that the water caused the dough to rise more and make the loaves bigger. And we learned that it was because the yeast decreases the pressure put on yeast molecules and allows it to perform fermentation quicker. So this increases yeast fermentation activity and causes the loaves with more water to expand more when fermenting. And the water also affects the consistency of the dough. So doughs with more water are more liquid-like, and this caused the texture to be more soft in loaves with more water content. And also, the breads with more water in them have larger and more air bubbles inside. And this is because, as we learned before, the fermentation is quicker in the breads with more water. So there will be more CO2 produced since CO2 is a product of fermentation.
Well, we controlled like a lot of the variables of the experiment. Again, a lot of them weren't very controlled. For example, as we said before in the control slide, the brand of the ingredients we didn't like specify, nor like the material of the baking pan, or and the temperature of the environment around the dough and the bread was something we couldn't really control other than in the oven. The brand of the ingredients could have changed to like the overall results, because if we got like our ingredients from different companies, like each of them could have done different things to them, to their products, which could have changed the overall results of like the bread after baking it. The material that the baking pan was made of could have changed the speed at which different like parts of the bread were heated up, and changed the rate of yeast activity, because like metal is a lot more heat conductive than glass is, right? And again, the temperature of the environment throughout like the entire process could have also affected things. For example, like we did it on different days and our houses are all different temperatures, like the overall room temperature. So if it were cooler, the dough wouldn't rise as fast, like in those 3 hours. Or like if the fridge were like warmer than another person's fridge, it also could like rise more than another person's. So just small things like that could have just changed the results of our bread, which would make sense as none of our data is perfectly like aligned. It's not perfectly linear.